I interviewed close to 100 people. So out of those 100 people, we hired 4.
But at what point did you think, wow, I've got something that's truly scalable here?
The media can harp on about the forecast of interest rate. I personally, passionately love property.
I noticed you're a pretty good cook.
Yeah, I love cooking.
What is going to happen this year?
I think we might be seeing 3 or 4 rate cuts this year. I think the average age now of a first home buyer in Sydney is 39 years old.
There definitely is a lot of ways a lot of people are unaware of that they can get into the market. Theo, welcome to The Margin, brought to you by GREENROCK Advisory. Really appreciate you coming down today.
Thank you, Michael, for having me. It's good to be here.
Very good. So, Theo, since 2013, I mean, your business, Shore Financial, started off doing around $5 million in monthly applications, and that's now grown to 200 to 300 million per month, which is extraordinary. Your team's grown. You've got about 32 brokers and 120 if you include your offshore support team. And your business has expanded vertically into financial planning, commercial asset management, and really you've consistently been ranked number 1 when it comes to independent brokerages in Australia. So that's a big intro. It's very well deserved, and I'm sure you're very proud of it. And thinking over the last couple of days where to start, I think we just start with the early days in your journey. How did you get into finance?
Yeah, well, there's no specific moment as such where there was like a realization, hey, I want to be a mortgage broker. I sort of fell into it. I used to, if we go back to the very start, I used to knock on doors selling Foxtel when I was like 19.
Okay.
I just knocked on someone's door who was an area manager at Commonwealth Bank. He offered me a job in the retail network of CBA. And initially I was like, banking, I don't want to get into banking and finance.
Yeah.
And then eventually I thought, okay, it'd be some good experience through uni. I joined CBA in the branch land. I was there for 3 years. And it was there where I sort of got into consumer lending, home loans, became a home loan specialist. But I bought my first property using a broker, even though I was a home loan specialist at CBA.
Okay.
So I thought this is a bit odd. I'm a mortgage specialist at CBA, and I used a broker to get a better deal.
Didn't like the policies at CBA?
It didn't get as good borrowing capacity or as good of an interest rate. So that broker who did my loan actually offered me a job, and that was a broker that worked at Oxygen Home Loans at McGrath. So I joined McGrath's in-house finance business, Oxygen, and that's where my journey in mortgage broking began.
And that's usually how a lot of these journeys start, through humble beginnings and falling into it. But what was the catalyst for Shore? So how did, and again, what a great name considering where you're geographically based, but Shore Financial, how did that start, and tell me about some of the defining moments? So there was a couple of guys at Oxygen, that McGrath's finance business, that is, that, between me and 2 others, we were doing 70% of the company's volume. So 3 of us out of 30 brokers were accountable for most of the revenue, and we used that to try and negotiate a position in McGrath's Oxygen. Those conversations with John McGrath didn't go so well. So that just sort of paved an exit for us. An opportunity externally came about, being an exclusivity agreement with the Richardson and Wrench network, 100 offices. They sort of heard that we were negotiating, and they wanted us to set up a finance business for them. So we set up a mortgage business that's partnered with real estate groups and has services tailored to integrate and support real estate businesses, except we did it on a non-exclusive basis. So it's not just Richardson and Wrench that we wanted to service. We wanted to service all of the real estate agents throughout Australia. Okay. And obviously that generated leads and business for you? Yeah.
In the early years, it was a very significant amount of our business as such, our volume. I'd say it was about 70% of our volume for the first year or 2 came from real estate referrals. But then with good service, good branding, and repeat sort of clients and word of mouth and whatnot, whilst we still have close to 2,400 real estate partners, they probably account for about 20 to 25% of our overall volume now. Just as we're 12 years old now, so the word of mouth of raving fans in our database just naturally spreads.
Well, and that brings me to the next point, which is really your business and the growth that it's gone through. So you built Shaw, obviously, as we mentioned at the start, into an award-winning firm, and you've got multiple accolades that Shaw's received. Tell me a little bit about the challenges that you've faced from going from, that 5 million in applications, 20 million a month in applications to where you are now.
So in the early days, I sort of hired mainly from my social network and my group of friends, which was good and bad, right? They were an integral part of the success, and we all had, a good work ethic and drive, and they were key success factor in the initial growth of Shaw Financial. But at the same time, once the business became a serious operation and we had a bit of scale, then everyone starts questioning their involvement long term in the business. So it went from having fun and everybody's trying to get the best they possibly can out of the occupation and such in the early years to some negotiations and ones that weren't probably dealt with in a professional forum, given that we were best friends. So that was a challenge. Shifting the business from a bunch of mates that were having a crack at something to making it more of a serious organization where things need to be dealt with professionally. That was definitely a challenge. And then I guess scaling for the growth. The problem with we're a commission-only business in the early days, and we still predominantly are. What I mean by that is all our brokers are contractors, and they only get paid basically on what they bring in. That also, in the early days, catering to the growth in terms of being able to scale the business under that model was a bit of a challenge, especially because I had two other business partners at the time. And so, if we had to put money in the business, we had to collectively put the same amounts, and everybody's got their own different circumstances. My business partners at the time had young kids, so they can't put too much money into the business to scale it for growth. So we had to make sure we had that balancing act of growing at a sustainable rate where we don't, outpace ourselves, and then all of a sudden it's unsustainable and it implodes.
Yeah, it's a challenge, and I can relate to that because entrepreneurs can have a bit of ADD, and it's hard when you see a lot of opportunities, but sometimes you need to really look at the risk profile of your business. But clearly you've got that measurement pretty spot on. Outside of the procedural and operational challenges that Shaw's faced in building the firm to date, tell me a little bit about the competition, because I listened to a recent podcast that you were on, and there's 19,000 brokers now in the industry or thereabouts. A lot of them are working remotely, or pajama brokers. That made me laugh, actually. There's a few of those people in our industry as well.
Yeah.
But how are you competing with all this competition, and do you keep being number one?
Well, I feel like there was a lot of competition from the day we joined, right? It wasn't like we joined an industry that was young and growing.
The early settlers.
Yeah. We joined an old industry, an archaic old industry where, it's been around for decades, and there was some big dominant players, some big franchise groups that, controlled the industry almost. But I guess at the time that we joined, the industry was also going through some technological change, I should say. And that's still happening. It's been happening for a decade, and I'm talking simple tech. I'm not talking like AI that does all the work for you. I'm just talking using electronic client forms to capture information, using a CRM system to streamline your sort of sales process, just using off-the-shelf type technology that 10 years ago, I'd say 90% of the industry wasn't using it. Even today, some of that stuff isn't really endorsed. So I guess going back to your question, we came in when I joined the industry before we started Shaw Financial. I saw an opportunity in taking market share from just doing some basic innovative stuff that the traditional broker wasn't doing. SMS marketing and things like that weren't being endorsed, and it actually, simple stuff, set us apart from the average mortgage broker.
Well, a fresh look at the industry, really. So the embracing technology, clearly something that you've mentioned here, which is can be a bit overwhelming at times. There's so much, new CRM systems, or should we use Salesforce or Zoho? And we face that today, and call center systems. So there is a lot of tech, but it seems to also be a bit of an arms race. Who can get there the fastest, get across the technology and embrace the technology, can take on some market share.
Embrace it's the key word there, I think, because sometimes in our industry there's technology at the broker's fingertips with their own aggregator that they're not actually even embracing and using.
Yeah, exactly. And another question that I'm interested in knowing, because the growth has just been huge from a personnel perspective, and you mentioned earlier on, which I can relate to, you hiring within your inner pool of friends. How have you maintained a strong, unified culture throughout that growth period?
That's also another one of the biggest challenges, I have to say. So I reckon last year I interviewed close to 100 people,
Wow.
Sometimes 2, 3, 4 interviews a week. So I'm allowing a bit of some time off there as well,
So you still do all the interviewing as well?
Yeah, of course. Yeah, definitely. You have to, because someone's going to represent your brand, and you're going to give them inquiry that's calling your main line or inquiring on your website. You want to know who's representing your brand in that inquiry.
Absolutely.
So out of the let's say 100 people I interviewed last year, we hired 4 people. So there's like a 4% hit rate on those interviews, you could say. So we're very selective of who we bring on board. It's more, the hardest thing to do in an interview, which is near impossible, is figure out someone's work ethic and attitude, because people can tell you all the right answers. They can tell you, I work 12-hour days and I can't wait to get into this industry, or can't wait to join your organization. And then the proof is in the pudding, 3-4 months later, you give them opportunity they don't fully take advantage of or capture. So that's been the hardest challenge is going through those interview processes and trying to actually find people with the right attitude.
Yeah.
And it has been, unfortunately, a lot of hard conversations of, do you want a bag or a box type thing, and seeing people out that don't quite align.
Yeah. So finding the right people in the business and getting them on the right seat on the bus, it sounds like something that, the fact that you're running that is great. Which brings me sort of to the next part of this from a leadership point of view. I seem to see, my transition from seeing hundreds and hundreds of clients a year now to being the CEO of my business, and could ask yourself sometimes, the CEO of what? You've got to make sure I'm working on meaningful things. How are you really hands-on, or do you delegate a lot of what you do? Or are you somewhere in between?
I was about to say I'm somewhere in between.
Yeah.
I think it's a weakness of a manager or a leader of a business to manage everything themselves, and you need to delegate and empower people with responsibility. And another challenge of that delegation is being willing to let others make mistakes. That's a huge one.
Totally.
So in delegation, if you micromanage that delegation and you get so angry or anxious that someone made a mistake in that process, that's your problem, right? Of course, address it and give constructive feedback, but you've got to be willing to let someone else be responsible for a task and be willing to let them make a mistake.
And at what point, was there a defining moment when you thought, you had this business and it was growing and obviously reaching new heights, but at what point did you think, wow, I've got something that's truly scalable here? When did you think that, I could take a lot of the market share?
Look, once again, there wasn't like a penny drop moment. Yeah. I feel like I've always been quite a passionate and hungry individual. And I think from the get-go, when we, established our website and called our business Shore Financial from day dot in 2013, I wanted to make the most of the opportunity, and I really passionately believed in a position in the marketplace that we could take. I felt that the average mortgage broker 12 years ago, wasn't that flash hot, and I personally passionately loved property. Now, it's quite a sort of synergy between real estate agents and property and mortgage brokers and finance, and that sort of passion worked in a great sort of prosperous way. It meant that we would harness relationships and they could recognize that we understood their business and understood the dynamics of helping clients in their business. So what I mean by that is that I truly had a passion and genuinely had a passion for seeing clients create wealth in property. Mm-hmm. And after a couple of years in business, when you start seeing that transpire, then I guess that's when the flame really ignites, that you're creating great outcomes for people.
Yeah, makes sense. And your passion for property, and I mean, I'm in property on a daily basis, but also have a genuine interest in finance, because you can't do one without the other, right? So, tell me a bit about your passion for property. What does that mean? Is it from an investment point of view? Is it what does that mean?
I like analysing property purchases I've made. So things I've hung on to, I constantly analyse whether they were good investments.
Are they all in Sydney?
Yes, I do have we most recently in our asset management business, we syndicated a shopping centre in the Gold Coast, which I was a significant investor in. So I do have a commercial asset in the Gold Coast, but majority of my property is in Sydney. All my residential is in Sydney, and some of them I look back at and go, that wasn't the best investment. They were good for a period of time, but now in hindsight, when I look at net yield, keyword net, and opportunity costs, right? As in, the cost of that capital and where I could actually put that capital and reallocate it for a better return. So I feel like in the last 5 years, I've got a bit of a different understanding to where I put my own personal money, and those that understanding is also something that resonates in conversations with clients, right? And we've got now a database of clients that are having the same realizations, especially in Sydney, in terms of residential investment properties. The yields aren't as attractive as they once were. Costs have gone sort of through the roof. Things like land tax. Rent hasn't increased proportionally at the same rate as house prices. So now other asset classes are looking more attractive.
Makes a lot of sense. And that might be the segue into the next section here, which is, the current state of the property market and the finance industry. There's so much global volatility everywhere. I mean, we only need to look back at yesterday. I think there was, 4.2% drop, or almost $100 billion wiped off the stock market yesterday. How are you, and that's just an isolated incident based off the tariffs. There was COVID, there was the Royal Commission, in particular, mortgage brokers were a subject of that. These are big, hurdles that would have impacted your business. How have you navigated through it as a leader? But also, how have you helped your clients get through these difficult times?
Yeah, it's a good question. And the power of sentiment and confidence the last few years has never been greater, in the sense that, the media can harp on about, something to do with the forecast of interest rates going up or down. It's a constant yo-yo, that forecast. It's 1 minute there's 3 increases to come, next minute there's 3 decreases. And those changing forecasts I've never seen influence consumers more. So if we go back, like I said, I was first in banking back in 2009, and just after the GFC. And I feel like there was, despite we just exited the global financial crisis, consumers still, when they bought a property, they didn't let any other noise get in the way of them transacting. Nowadays, it's a different landscape. It's just people are constantly, they're being fed an abundance of information at their fingertips on their phone, right? And all types of platforms, no matter what they're looking at, they're being served content throughout the day, hours of content they're probably consuming each day. And that's overwhelming, right? So it's a good question. How do you keep your clients focused? How do you keep the team focused? I think it's easy to deter a message of, fear selling from the media sometimes. And sometimes we just say to our clients, look, anything could happen tomorrow. Your objective is to purchase a home. I think what a bit of a philosophy I've had from day one is that, that you can never really time the market. You'll never, and this is for property and equities and various asset classes, you'll never really pick the top or pick the bottom, right? the hardest thing to do in property is probably find, as a home, I'm referring to, is find something that you actually want to purchase and move in as a family, let's say. That's the biggest challenge, especially in tight competitive markets like Sydney. So I just say to our consumers, when you find that right property, who cares about the external factors and the noise and what might happen in the next 6 months? Yeah, sure, you know, interest rates might go up or down, and there might be a 3, 4, 5% variance on the price. But long term, the bigger challenge is finding that perfect house, which is typically the perfect amount of compromise, right? So just stay on that goal.
Stay on that goal and make sure it's really clear of what they want to achieve. We touched on interest rates, and definitely need to ask you this question because you would know more than most of the general punters out there. What is going to happen this year? What's your prediction?
Well, going back to that changing landscape and I call it the yo-yo analogy, where it's, it's for the last 4 years, it's been up and down the forecast like a yo-yo. And if you asked me this question a week ago, not even a week ago, 2-3 days ago, I would have had a different answer, right? Now, we've just seen a record sell-off in equities globally. The US and Australian share market has sort of come off in similar proportions as it did in COVID and the GFC. I think if it comes off another 2 to 3%, it's a bigger sell-off than both those two events, which have been major events. There's talks of a global recession. That would now, off the back of that, we've seen the government already indicate that, and the markets are pricing in a potential 50 basis point cut at the next RBA meeting next month in May. That would, I think that's quite likely. I think we're definitely going to see at least 25 basis points being cut next month and potentially 50 points, so 0.5%.
Okay, wow.
I think this year, given the state of the global economy, and in the most recent inflation data, which was a monthly indicator that came out a week or two ago, but the quarterly data, which is the more crucial one that's coming out the end of this month, if that is in the target range, which is that 2 to 3% range, I think we might be seeing 3 or 4 rate cuts this year. Now, couple that with talks of a global recession, people are going to say, well, does that mean it's a good time to buy property? If you look historically where we've had to use interest rates to stimulate the economy, like the pandemic in COVID and also in the GFC, the GFC was a global financial crisis. It was one of the biggest financial crises of all time. And we only saw property prices come off in Sydney 7%. I'm not sure what it was locally here. And then because of the interest rate cuts that were in the later half of 2008, we saw the market in 09 and 10 rally, the property prices, that is. So I think we'll see a similar effect because interest rates are directly correlated to property prices, and interest rate cuts always put upward pressure on prices. So I think we'll see a buoyant property market off the back of these rate cuts. And we probably won't see the growth until we bottom out with those cuts, because that's when we'll see a big improvement in borrowing powers. So probably 6 to 12 months away. Okay.
I sort of share a similar view. And it does feel property feels a little bit insulated at the moment, especially with everything that we've just spoken about then. So, Theo, obviously you'll be right at the coalface and see various trends within the property market. What have you seen in the past that you've taken note of, and what do you see happening in the future of the Australian property market?
Yeah, so our business is predominantly Sydney-based, so we're seeing Sydney trends. And one trend in particular, there's a couple, but I'll give 2 shout-outs actually. There's 2 major trends I'm seeing. One in particular is rent vesting. So for first home buyers, Sydney's become extremely unaffordable, basically. And I think the average age now of a first home buyer in Sydney is 39 years old, 40% of which are buying as dual applicants. We've seen the average household income to average house price ratio at most disproportionate levels we've ever seen before. So it's a real stretch for people to buy a home they want to live in, especially if you're at 39 years of age and you've potentially got a family. So we see people that have some cash savings and can't afford the home they want, but they want to deploy their cash and capital into an investment. And it's the Aussie dream to, buy property. It's the most, I feel like, bullish and confident asset class Australians believe in. So people are buying in other states and continuing to rent whilst they invest in a property in an area they might not have ever even visited or will ever visit. They'll employ a buyer's agent to buy in other markets like Brisbane, Adelaide, Perth, Melbourne, for example, and they might not even ever inspect the property, see the property, and own it for an extended period of time and hope to sell it with a gain to then use the capital uplift to get a home themselves one day.
Absolutely. That's a core part of what our business really does, isn't it? We would be tabling these strategies and ideas to people 6 or 7 years ago, and they just would not want to have a bar of it. People want that sense of home ownership without really realising the ownership is predominantly with the banks. And they are investing in growth corridors or, as you mentioned, in areas where by the time the property's built or they've acquired it, they might not even have gone and seen the property itself. So I definitely see that as a viable option, because to own a home in Sydney, what's the median house price now for a house in Sydney?
I think it's about 1.8. Might be way off there, maybe 1.9.
Yeah.
But it's houses have increased a lot more aggressively the past 4 years since COVID compared to units. I think units will play catch up in Sydney, which is also an argument that people will start looking at the Sydney market and they think how much more price growth is left. So
what do you think about that? I mean, because it just keeps growing. So
well, if you look at things purely from an investment point of view, there is an argument there, sure, especially if you're looking at things purely from an investment point of view and you look at yields, right? It's a challenge to find any investment in Sydney that's giving you 3 to 4% yield gross, right? Yeah. You found a gem if you're getting something at that return. Typically things are more around 2 to 3%. In other markets like Brisbane, it's not a challenge at all. You can find assets that are 4 to 5% growth and 4 to 5% yield. And while some might argue, well, that's because there's less growth, I sort of tend to beg the opposite. In Brisbane, for example, it's the highest population growth as a city, the highest growing city in Australia. I think it's about 1.3% per annum at the moment, and it has been for a decade, and it's forecasted to do so the next decade, with some glowing signs and reasons for that growth. It's not just the affordability factor. A lot of people think that there's a lot of interstate migration driving that from Melbourne and Sydney, people that are priced out of these markets and looking at a home there, and they can pack up their bags and still keep their occupation in a different state. Yeah, sure, there's a bit of that going on, but Brisbane as a CBD is also thriving. It's going through the same thing Melbourne went through.
It's an incredible city now.
Yeah, it's going through the same thing that Melbourne went through 10, 20 years ago, where huge corporates are moving their head offices there because it's cheaper rent, cheaper wages, and they can run the same business at 30% less.
And do you have an opinion on the Melbourne property market? Because the Melbourne market's had a lot of
negativity as such.
It has been the whipping state over the last few years, and our business model moves around to where we think is best. We're not we are based in Melbourne, but we're not property centric just for Melbourne. So Perth was successful. Southeast Queensland we think is getting expensive, but as you mentioned, like the data still supports the growth. But all of a sudden, Melbourne's sort of been left here, and it's looking pretty affordable, and there's a lot of opportunity here, we believe. What do you think about that?
Yeah, 100% agree. I think you also always want to go against the grain, right? So in recent times, we've seen equities and share markets globally being sold off, and that's the time to buy. When everybody's selling, that's when you actually should be purchasing, because as it stands today, you can be picking up even index funds. The ASX, S&P 500 or NASDAQ, any of those three indexes are basically off. If you get a geared one, like a leverage one, you could potentially pick it up at 50% off its peak price. So I think same principles and reasoning goes for Melbourne. Yes, it's been a tough time. There's been sort of huge reform in the state government and the subsequent taxes and whatnot that's caused, a bit of a issue with growth and prices. But I think that's plateaued, and I think now's the time actually to look at Melbourne. Ironically, some other podcasts I listen to highlight that opportunity as such. A lot of buyers agents that operate nationally are talking about the appeal of Melbourne as an investment option for their investors. I think we've probably seen the worst of it as such.
Yeah, and it makes sense because in these other areas that are popular right now and have had a really good run, it's quite hard to get something as well. So there's a little bit more bargaining power in Melbourne.
And if it stayed buoyant through what has happened the past few years, that's a good sign too, right? I think, what's the Airbnb tax? I think it's 7% of revenue or something, and that's the highest, I think, Airbnb tax globally. And things like that, like if the market can be resilient enough to stay afloat and stay buoyant through times like that, then it's a good sign that you're buying at a healthy level, right?
Yeah, and politically there's been a few issues down here that have put people off. Another point I wanted to actually mention with you, because you've dived into the financial planning aspect through a different vertical, and purchasing property is becoming more and more popular through a self-managed super fund. What are your thoughts around that?
So it's funny you say that, because that was the second trend I was going to touch on when I said I got two trends in the property market that we're seeing. So perfect segue. There's been loads of articles come out in the last 5 years highlighting the lack of performance in traditional super funds. So even those, industry super funds,
they make it look pretty good.
Yeah, they do. They're great ads, right? Everybody knows these ones. There's been a huge sort of realization that these super funds, 80% of super funds, I believe the stat is, don't even meet the ASX index as a benchmark for the last 5 or 10 years.
Wow.
Now, the ASX index also isn't the best benchmark to try and outperform, because our ASX hasn't really done that well for the past decade or so, ever since the GFC. I think up until June last year, the ASX all up historically for a decade returned 7.9%, which is growth and distributions and dividends, right? So that's not that good. And the super funds aren't even meeting that, 80% of them. So I think there's been a bit of a penny drop moment and a realization my super fund sucks, basically. And people are feeling that they can outperform their fund manager. And that's also, to the talk of, TikTok influencers, finance influencers, and all this abundance of information at people's fingertips. The average Joe Blow, especially the next generation, people in their 20s and 30s, they feel sophisticated enough to make investment decisions on their own. They see less value in paying fund managers 1% or 2% or whatever they may charge to manage their super. And a lot of people are, saying, all right, well, I like these geared index funds, ETFs. Everyone, a typical investor knows about ETFs these days, and these are, passive funds at much lower fees, and people are competent enough to make those investment decisions themselves. Separate to that is the power of leverage on your superannuation fund. So what I mean by that, let's say that you've got a $200,000 balance in your super, and that could be your own superannuation or combined with a family, friend, or partner. You can have up to 5 members in a joint super fund, and you can all put disproportionate contributions in, and you just get various amounts of units. With $200,000, let's say you are in one of those industry super funds or in traditional super funds, and you've been getting 7% thereabouts for the last decade. That means you're getting, let's say this year on 200 grand, you're getting $14,000 return. With $200,000, you can easily go buy $1 million property, because you can actually get, you can borrow money up to a 90% LVR at the moment in your super. I do not recommend that. That's not what I'm suggesting, but you can. Let's say you buy $1 million property which would be at roughly 80%. You need to factor in stamp duty, so maybe a bit more. And let's say most capital cities in Australia, or let's just look at the East Coast ones. Let's look at Sydney, Brisbane, and Melbourne. Those cities historically have performed between 5 to 7% as annual property price growth. That 5 to 7% is on the $1 million, meaning you're getting $50,000 to $70,000 per annum, as opposed to the 7% on the $200,000 in super fund being $14,000. So that power of leverage really outperforms what you can do in a traditional super fund, right? Now, sure, some people might say, well, what about the interest costs on the 80% LVR or the debt in the super fund? Well, if you assume that if you pick it right and you balance it where the property is at least cash flow neutral or ideally positively geared, hence why I emphasize an 80% LVR, because you should achieve that at that level, then basically the rent will cover the interest. So you're just banking on capital growth, and that will always be in your favor then with the power of leverage.
And the lending structure is different in a self-managed super fund, as you're aware. You know, rates are relatively on par, would you say, outside of super fund now, a little bit higher? Or
unfortunately, they're not on par. They're a little bit higher, but it's worth the price, because the big difference with super fund lending, SMSF lending, I should say, because you need to set up an SMSF to be able to purchase a property in your super. The big difference is that it's a non-recourse loan. It's a sort of a separate entity that is responsible for the money. What I mean by that is that the loan in your super fund can never have an adverse effect to your personal circumstances, which is a huge one for our investors. So the biggest problem that we see in our database of clients, of residential sort of owner-occupiers and investors, is that people like the idea of trying to accrue residential investments. Most typical thing we see is someone retains their previous home, which might have been a 2-bedroom apartment, let's say, and when they upsize to a family home, they keep the apartment as an investment. That's very cliche as such. However, the debt structure in that transition is normally not ideal. Debt structure being they typically have a low amount of debt on their residential investment and a lot of debt on their home, which you want the opposite. You want to minimize your non-deductible debt on your home and increase the deductible debt on your investment. And second to that, we find that people actually are limited in what they can do in terms of upsizing their home, or let's say they have purchased their home in cashing out to renovate their home, because the investment property is having an adverse effect on their serviceability, because even though it might be positively geared, the bank is assessing that serviceability on that debt on the investment property with that buffer of 2.5% to 3%. So today they're calculating your affordability, that you need to be able to afford that investment debt at 8.5%, 9%. So it's having a significant adverse effect on their serviceability and borrowing power. And sometimes it prevents a household, a family, from being able to buy a home or upsize their home. So what we're seeing is that a lot of people now are turning to SMSF purchasing, because that debt and that loan will never hinder their ability to upsize their home. And they've learned the hard way, because they've, let's say, purchased an investment which they've retained for 3-4 years, and they've had to let it go in order to upsize their home. And you typically don't want to purchase an investment property for only 3-4 years, because if you blend the cost of acquisition, the stamp duty, and the cost of selling, being agent fees, all up, call it 6-7%. That's over a 3-4 year period. That's eating a healthy amount of your return. So yeah, that's, I think, a leading factor to people now looking at alternative investment structures.
Yeah, and we're definitely seeing that here at GREENROCK as well. The self-managed super fund through our financial planning partners has been really popular and is gaining more popularity for all of those reasons that you've mentioned. I think what's a really important topic that we've sort of outlined there is people pulling money together. It is really challenging now, and it's really the cost of living and the trends that we're seeing, and all the political campaigns around housing or the cost of living. So you're a young investor, you're 24, 25, and you want to get into the property market. We mentioned there's rent vesting and there's self-managed super funds. What structures do you think work well? And if you were in this position, what path would you go down?
Well, that's a great segue once again to probably talking about our commercial syndication business, Shore Invest.
Yep.
But before I go there, I think to answer your question initially, diversification is the key, right? So I think sometimes people saturate their capital in one marketplace. So a lot of people like buying in marketplaces they know. So they grow up in an area. They like I said, they might have bought an apartment in that area, and then they transition to a house, and they keep the apartment, and then all of a sudden their wealth is in one marketplace. Same thing happens for some of these rent investors. Some of them, it feels like that movie, The Big Short, where some people are buying multiple investment properties interstate in a certain marketplace, and all their money is saturated in one and concentrated in one area. So I think the key is diversification, and that goes from not just area but state and other asset classes like equities and different sectors like commercial. You mentioned something about pulling capital together, and that's the most crucial thing to do in commercial property. So typically people can't really purchase attractive commercial assets on their own. Even if you could spend $5 to $10 million on a commercial property, it's probably not going to be that good of an asset at that price in all the major cities and blue chip areas, right? I think once you start going above, let's say, $20 million, you start getting significant commercial assets which have, a bit of a tenant mix. So you could have 10, 20 tenants in the asset. So you've got some lower risk because you're not subject to one tenant leaving or one tenant going bankrupt or whatnot. One tenant might make up 5% of your overall revenue. So by pooling capital together and purchasing assets with other investors, you get into the realms of lower risk, higher returns. So our commercial syndication business, for example, we pooled 137 investors together. We raised $48 million and we purchased a $86 million shopping centre in the Gold Coast. That return was 7.8% net for our investors. So that was the net passing yield on the acquisition.
And were these your clients as well, or is it a bit of a mix?
Bit of a mix. We did a JV with Wingate, who are the licensed asset manager on the fund, because it's actually its own property fund, that one asset. It's a single asset fund, but they're the ASIC licensed property manager or asset manager. But by us pulling together those 137 investors collectively, we, like I said, got exposure to something paying 7.8% net yield. On top of that, there was 42 tenants with national brands like IGA, Guzman & Gomez, or Porto's, Dendy's Movie Cinema, and those big tenants, which what they call the anchor tenants. The biggest tenant makes up maybe 4 or 5% of the overall revenue. So even though they've got 10, 15 year leases, the shopping centre had a 9.8 year WALE, so very long leases. Even if one of them was to go and solve for some reason and go bankrupt, very low risk. What I also loved about that acquisition, which is I think it's similar to some of your own personal ventures, is it was a distressed sale. We purchased it off the receivers. The developer, it was a brand new shopping centre that the developer unfortunately ran out of money and had cost blowout and time delays through COVID. So we were dealing with the receivers, and we bought it well below true value. Commercial at the moment is very attractive as well, because commercial property, that is, because commercial valuations are directly correlated to interest rates. When interest rates go up, generally commercial valuations go down, because it's all about the net yield and the cap rate on these commercial acquisitions. And even institutions need a higher rate of return when interest rates are high, because every acquisition is part debt funded. So it's quite opportunistic right now looking at commercial acquisitions, but I would just warn investors that commercial property is a broad sector. There's various sectors within commercial, and be wary when investing in commercial.
Yeah, it's definitely that next level of experience where we find our clients that are heavily involved in commercial have been investing for a long time. They are able to deploy more capital. The barrier to entry is a lot harder, and you're exactly right. What are you actually getting for $2, $3, $4 million these days that can justify outlaying that much capital is the questions that need to be asked. So there definitely is a lot of ways that a lot of people are unaware of that they can get into the market, and people are so obsessed with the property market. And as we've touched on, it might be renting where you want to live and investing in somewhere outside of your geographical zone to chase better returns, which are out there. pooling that money together with your mates and people, which was back when my grandparents, migrated here from Europe, that's how they got started. Everyone got their money together and they worked 2 to 3 jobs and
delivering groceries and helping out the neighbour.
Yeah, and there might have been a bit of an easy period there for 30, 40 years, but the people within that generation won't think so. Everyone thinks they're living within their means. But the fund model that you've mentioned there through Shaw, what's that called? To provide more details around that.
So our business is called Shaw Invest, but the general industry as such that does that is it's asset management is probably the best description, but it's syndicating commercial buildings on an asset by asset basis. So I typically don't like pooled asset funds, so property funds that have a pool of assets. I like individual syndication businesses or individual asset funds. So when it's just on a property by property basis, they syndicate the asset and the fund. That way, investors and me personally, I feel like you have a tangible position on that asset.
You have a sense of ownership as well over that asset.
But then you know exactly that my X amount of contribution is giving me X amount of ownership in that specific property, and then it's easier for investors then to make a decision because they only need to look at the one asset. Some of our investors even flew up to the Gold Coast to inspect the property. With some of these other property funds that have a dozen or so properties in the fund, they're not going to go inspect all a dozen properties, right? So it's just it feels like a more tangible investment for our investors and me personally to commit to. There are lots of good sort of asset managers in commercial out there. Not saying that we're the pioneer and the best in that space. It's been around for a long time. It's becoming more common, and at the moment, with high interest rates, it's becoming very attractive for many sophisticated investors that are transferring, let's say, their money out of private credit, which has a decreasing future return with expectation of lower rates, compared to commercial, which has a forecast of increasing distributions as rates go down. So, for example, that shopping centre, if we get a 0.5% cut by the RBA next month, everybody's distribution subsequently increase because there is a debt component, a 55% LVR on the acquisition itself.
Which increases what goes around. And what is the minimum investment? You don't need to discuss that, but is there a minimum capital injection required for an investor?
Yeah, so 2 components. $100,000 is the minimum investment, which we might increase in the next round just because there was a lot of conversations around that level that didn't progress. Second part is you need to be a sophisticated investor because it's done under a ASIC wholesale license. With 2 different AFSLs involved. Wingate has their own AFSL and so do we, and we had to do it under a wholesale license, which meant that you need to be a sophisticated investor as per ASIC requirements, which means that you either have to have $250,000 in annual income or 2.5 million in net assets, one or the other. And your accountant needs to sign a wholesale certificate, investor certificate, so to say that you qualify.
But it's a brilliant way for people that do qualify and want to get into the commercial space without taking on all the risk. You're still getting great returns.
And key element wants to diversify. So someone who's it's probably to define the type of investor this is suited toward. It's someone who's a seasoned residential investor. They've purchased multiple residential properties over their sort of lifetime, and they might own 1 or 2 residential investments, and they're just wanting diversification, and they understand the ins and outs of property, and they're willing to sort of diversify into commercial.
Another question I've got for you, especially for a lot of Melburnians, is there's this general consensus that houses outperform apartments. We're starting to see a bit of a shift here. Obviously, Sydney, it's a very different narrative. Apartments can do really well from a capital growth point of view and potentially a yield point of view as well. What's your opinion on that?
So this is definitely a hot topic, and there's loads of articles circulating online from REA and whatnot, sort of highlighting that trend shift that you're alluding to. So basically, since COVID, there's been a real drive on houses, a real run on houses versus apartments. And look, it doesn't take a rocket scientist to figure out that when you're locked up at home, more space is ideal, right? So through COVID, people were locked up, working from home, not leaving the house 7 days a week. And there was a desire to buy a home.
Or move to the country.
Yeah, huge sort of sprawl to regional areas. Now, I think that the run on house prices has left a gap between houses and units that is just not justified and disproportionate, and buyers are now just chasing value, right? Mm-hmm. And because there's been such a run on houses nationally, now owner occupiers and investors see the appeal in units because in Sydney, for example, you can get a pretty average 2-bedroom home for the same price as a really nice luxury 3-bedroom unit with parking, let's say. The 2-bedroom home definitely won't have parking for the same price, right? So I think now, a family with young kids are just saying that I like the apartment life. I'm going to get more of a house. It's probably going to be in a better area for me as well. I don't need to redo the roof and fix the yard and whatnot. So we're seeing a sort of a shift towards units definitely in Sydney and in other marketplaces.
One of the last sort of topics here. What habits do you perform on a daily or weekly basis to keep you sane and level-headed?
So one thing my wife would have
I noticed you're a pretty good cook.
Yeah, actually. I love cooking.
See,
yeah,
cooking,
so I love cooking and I love wine. They're my sort of two things on the weekend that go hand in hand, literally.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's on a Friday afternoon or a Saturday. I'm getting ready to plan when I'm cooking for the weekend. It's a weekend activity mainly because you take some time to prepare what you need to go grocery shopping for and whatnot, right? During the week, my wife does most of the cooking, which is pretty. It's the healthy options during the week.
Okay, so you're ready to go.
I'm the carnivore cook doing the meats and whatnot. She's doing the vegan options to keep us healthy.
Yeah.
But I guess back on the question, my wife would say, and I'm talking about her a lot, but my wife would say I consume news too much. I'm a news sort of addict. I sort of wake up when I look at the news straight away, turn on the news. I record the news, so when I get home, I can download what the world is watching.
What publication, what news are you
I hate to admit it, but it's 9 News for me that I record. Okay. Just because I also want to stay relevant for what the world is seeing on the news. Mm-hmm. Unfortunately, I feel 9 News isn't so bad in terms of being too far left or right. I feel like they're somewhat in the middle, but I feel like a lot of news forums these days are far left or far right, which really influences the messaging and people's emotions and decision making. But I do dance between other news stations to see what the far right or the far left might be saying. And then podcasts is the other sort of information I sort of download on a daily basis. Maybe not daily. I mainly listen to podcasts when I'm training, going for a run or going to the gym, which is quite boring at the gym if you could think about working out to someone lecturing you about economics or something like that.
Yeah.
But that's just a sign of the times of growing with age, I guess.
Absolutely. And finally, Theo, what does success look like to you, and what's the future look like for Shaw over the next few years?
Success looks like to me where everyone in the business is also successful, right?
Right.
Success is where at the end of a beautiful journey, everybody, reaps the reward of building a long-term project together. So running a business is simply a long-term project. That's all it is. True success in a business is typically over a very long period of time. Continuity was one of the things I was always brought up to believe is the key factors to success. So sticking to something for a very long time is the definition of continuity in my eyes. So if you're jumping around professions, jumping around industries, it's sometimes hard to see true success because you're not, continuously improving your skill set at one particular trade. So we're doing that now, I guess, in mortgage broking, and we're building a beautiful business that, as you have alluded to earlier, is vertically integrated to other things. And now I guess the next part of our journey is taking it to the next step, and hopefully a stage in which others can share in the success in a bigger picture as such.
Well, I'd like to get you back on here in a couple of years and see what's developed. If it's anything like the current trajectory, I'm sure you would have done a lot. But yeah, really appreciate you coming on board, mate. Thank you.
No worries. Thanks for having me here.
Good stuff.